Family background of Steve Jobs. Today we gon' talk about the California King, Steve Jobs, and some notes from his private diary, what he wrote for success. Let's begin the biography of the Steve Jobs, born unwanted, raised to change the world. Steve Jobs was born on February 24, 1955 in San Francisco, California, but his birth wasn't wrapped in celebration. It began with silence, uncertainty, and a secret. You know why? Because of no parents, Steve wasn't raised by his biological parents. He was the child of Abdul Fattah Jandali, a Syrian Muslim immigrant pursuing a PhD in political science, and Joanne Schiebel, a Catholic woman from a strict German-American family. Their love was real, but forbidden. Joanne's family refused to accept that she was dating a Muslim man from the Middle East. And when she became pregnant at just 23, they gave her an ultimatum: either give up the baby or lose her family. That baby was Steve. Joanne and Abdul Fattah made the heartbreaking decision to put him up for adoption. They hoped, at least, that he'd go to a family of scholars, someone with college degrees. But the first couple who promised to adopt him changed their minds at the last minute. So, Steve was finally adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, a humble, working-class couple in Los Altos, California. Neither of them had a college education. In fact, Paul Jobs was a mechanic, and Clara worked as a bookkeeper. When Joanne found out they weren't college graduates, she initially refused to sign the papers. But Paul and Clara made her a promise. They would do whatever it took to send Steve to college. Only then, she agreed. And so, from the very beginning, Steve Jobs' life started with rejection, sacrifice, and a promise. The Jobs family, not rich, but rich in love. Paul and Clara Jobs weren't wealthy. They lived modestly in a small home, surviving paycheck to paycheck. Paul repaired cars in the family garage and later worked as a machinist. He was a quiet man, but incredibly skilled with his hands. He taught Steve how to build things, fix machines, and respect craftsmanship. Clara was a gentle, loving woman. She'd had a previous miscarriage and couldn't bear children again, which made Steve their entire world. They raised him in Mountain View, part of what would later become Silicon Valley. But back then, it wasn't tech. It was a blue-collar neighborhood filled with mechanics, laborers, and factory workers. Steve later said, "I was very lucky. My parents were loving, and I always felt special." Still, they weren't financially well off. They couldn't afford luxuries. Even buying a new bicycle was a big deal. But Paul saved every extra penny to send Steve to a good school. Education was their mission, not riches. And yet, even in childhood, Steve was different. He was curious, rebellious, bold. His teachers described him as difficult but brilliant. He once poured ink on a teacher's desk just to watch the reaction. But by 4th grade, he was so advanced that they wanted to skip him ahead 2 years. Steve refused. A second family secret. As Steve grew older, he found out the truth. He was adopted. It shook him. He once asked his parents, "Does that mean you didn't want me?" And they replied, "No, Steve. We specifically chose you." That moment changed him. It filled him with a strange mix of abandonment and pride. It made him independent, stubborn, and deeply driven to prove his worth. He said later in life, "Knowing I was adopted made me feel special, but it also made me question everything." Early influences. How his world began to shift in middle school. Steve became fascinated with electronics. He would visit his neighbor's garage, a man who worked for Hewlett-Packard, and take apart radios just to rebuild them. At age 12, he boldly called the CEO of HP asking for spare parts to build a frequency counter. Instead of brushing him off, the CEO gave him the parts and a summer internship at HP. That same year, Steve met Steve Wozniak, a fellow electronics whiz who would one day help him create Apple. But at home, the Jobs family still struggled. They didn't have enough money to buy Steve a car, so he and Wozniak built and sold illegal blue boxes, devices that could make free long-distance calls just to earn some extra cash. It was a risky move, but Steve would later say, without those blue boxes, there would be no Apple. College and rebellion. The promise fulfilled. In 1972, Paul and Clara fulfilled their promise to Steve's biological mother. They sent him to Reed College, a private liberal arts school in Oregon. But Steve dropped out after just one semester. Why? Because he didn't want to waste his parents' money on something he wasn't passionate about. Instead, he slept on friends' floors, returned Coke bottles for change, and walked miles every week to the Hare Krishna temple for free meals. But during that dropout phase, he attended classes secretly, especially ones on calligraphy, design, and Eastern philosophy. He said, "If I had never dropped in on that class, the Mac would never have had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts." Even in poverty, Steve was absorbing the world, preparing for something bigger. The hidden trauma of Steve Jobs. The wounds that shaped a genius. We often see Steve Jobs as a confident, bold, even rebellious visionary. But what we don't see is the emotional chaos behind that drive. His trauma didn't come from violence, it came from silence, from something much deeper, being given away. The invisible scar of abandonment. Steve Jobs was only a few days old when he was separated from his biological mother. He never knew her voice, never saw her face in those first crucial weeks of bonding. He was placed into a system that almost failed him. The first couple who agreed to adopt Steve backed out at the last moment. They wanted a girl. That's 2 rejections before he could even walk. Steve didn't learn about this until years later. But when he did, it cut deep. He once told his biographer, "I was rejected. I was abandoned." It left a mark. This sense of abandonment haunted Steve throughout his life. He often pushed people away before they could get close. He became obsessively controlling, trying to shape the world around him, because deep down, he couldn't control his beginning. Psychologists call this core shame, the feeling that you are flawed at your foundation. Steve carried that. A secret he didn't share with anyone in childhood. He was told he was adopted, but not what that meant. At school, when other kids found out, they mocked him. "You're not wanted. You're not real." Steve ran home crying. He asked his parents, "So, does this mean I'm not really your son?" And they told him, "No, Steve, you're ours, 100%. We chose you." That gave him comfort, but also pride, almost arrogance. He began seeing himself as chosen, someone different, special, destined. But this belief also made him isolated. He rarely fit in. He was bored in school, rebellious, even rude to authority. A deeper trauma, loss of control. At around age 12, Steve had another traumatic experience. Though not physical, it left an emotional wound. He discovered that his biological parents eventually got married after giving him up. And not only that, they had another child, a daughter. Steve was shocked. He asked himself, why me? Why did they keep her so and give me away? It wasn't logical. It wasn't fair. But it fed that emotional scar. He wasn't good enough. He wasn't wanted. Even though Steve would later reconnect with his biological sister, novelist Mona Simpson, he refused to meet his birth father. Even when Abdul Fattah tried, Steve later said, "I don't want to meet him. I have no interest. I was abandoned. He means nothing to me." That wasn't hatred. It was pain, unprocessed, unspoken. Any accidents or illness in early life? Steve Jobs didn't suffer any major physical illnesses or accidents during childhood that were publicly recorded. But what he did suffer from was mental unrest. Here are a few things he experienced that affected him deeply. Sensory overload, possible neurodivergence. As a child, Steve showed signs of sensory hypersensitivity. He hated loud noises, couldn't tolerate certain textures, and would have extreme reactions to minor discomforts. Some biographers and teachers believe he may have had traits of high-functioning autism or Asperger's, though never formally diagnosed. He was extremely intelligent, but socially distant at times. This made it hard to make friends. He became lonely, often isolating himself from other kids, preferring machines and books to playmates. Mental withdrawal. After discovering he was adopted and that he had a sister he never met, Steve began to withdraw. He would go silent for hours, staring at walls, drawing, or disassembling electronics in his garage. Paul Jobs, his adoptive father, once said, "Steve could sit in the garage for 8 hours without speaking a word, just building. It was like he was escaping something. That escape was his coping mechanism. Instead of confronting his feelings, he built things. Instead of asking for love, he created." Spiritual longing and disconnect. As Steve entered his teenage years, the trauma didn't go away. He became obsessed with Eastern philosophy, Zen Buddhism, and the idea of inner peace. He even traveled to India at age 19, barefoot, searching for a guru. But what was he really looking for? Peace? Purpose? Or the feeling of belonging? His biographer, Walter Isaacson, later said, "Steve was always trying to fill a hole, one created in infancy, that no success could patch." What shaped young Steve Jobs? He was abandoned at birth, then rejected again by his first adoptive couple. Raised by loving but working-class parents, far from the wealthy tech circles he'd later dominate. He found out his biological parents later married and kept their next child, igniting a deep inner rage. He struggled with loneliness, mental withdrawal, and emotional coldness, often misread as arrogance. There were no major physical injuries or illnesses, but emotionally, Steve Jobs carried invisible scars his entire life. The life-changing person and event that transformed Steve Jobs, the mentor who unlocked his mind. Mr. Impressed, 4th grade teacher, Imogene Teddy. Hill. Steve Jobs was out of control in elementary school. He'd prank teachers, refuse homework. One teacher even said he was on a path to jail. But everything changed in 4th grade when he met Imogene Hill, known as Teddy. She didn't punish him. She saw potential. She gave Steve a challenge. "Finish this math workbook, and I'll give you $5. He finished it in 2 days. Then she gave him another, then another. He loved it. But more than the reward, she believed in him. And that belief changed Steve forever. He later said, "She turned me around. She saw something in me and made me believe I was worth something." From that point forward, Steve jumped 2 grades ahead, landing in middle school early. That one teacher saved him. The spiritual shift, his journey to India at age 19. At 19, Steve Jobs had everything going for him. He had just dropped out of Reed College, but he was brilliant, hungry, and already working with Steve Wozniak. Yet he felt empty. Success, logic, money didn't satisfy him. He said, "I was searching for something deeper." So he did something radical. In 1974, Steve flew to India with a backpack and a head full of questions. He shaved his head, lived barefoot, walked village to village in the heat, slept on floors, got sick from dysentery, and met spiritual seekers who believed in things like energy, vibration, and the inner self. He went searching for the guru Neem Karoli Baba. But the guru had died before Steve arrived. Still, the journey shaped him, not with answers, but with awareness. He returned to America more grounded, more minimalist, more focused. He became obsessed with Zen Buddhism, simplicity, and intuition. The people in India didn't have anything, but they were happier than the rich Americans I knew. That changed me. The genius who brought his ideas to life, Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs, had vision. But Steve Wozniak had engineering magic. They were opposites. Wozniak was shy, soft-spoken, and deeply technical. Jobs was loud, passionate, and a master salesman. But together, they made something unforgettable. Wozniak built the first Apple computer in his garage. Jobs convinced people to buy it. Jobs often said, "Woz was the first person I met who was smarter than me," in his own way. Wozniak gave Steve confidence that his wild visions could actually be built. And without him, there would have been no Apple. The rejection that broke him. Getting fired from Apple. Imagine creating your own company, pouring your soul into it, then being told, "We don't want you anymore." That's exactly what happened in 1985. Apple's board, fearing Steve's bold, chaotic style, sided with the new CEO, John Sculley, and fired Jobs from his own company. Jobs was devastated. He later said, "I was out," and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone. It was devastating, but that failure became his greatest teacher. The comeback, building Next and Pixar. Instead of quitting, Steve started again. He built Next Computers, a company with futuristic tech. At the time, it failed commercially, but its software later became the foundation of macOS. At the same time, he bought a small animation studio and renamed it Pixar. That studio would go on to produce Toy Story, the world's first 3D animated feature. Both of these moves seemed risky, even crazy. But when Apple bought Next in 1996, Steve Jobs returned to Apple, stronger than ever. He reinvented the brand, and within years he launched the iMac, then the iPod, then the iPhone, and the world would never be the same. Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have happened to me. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. The woman who grounded him, Laurene Powell Jobs. In 1991, Steve met Laurene, a Stanford MBA student. She wasn't just smart. She was grounded, compassionate, real. Steve fell in love fast. He said, "I was in the parking lot and I just thought, if this is my last day on Earth, I want to spend it with her." They got married, had 3 children together, and Laurene became the emotional anchor of Steve's adult life. She balanced him, softened his edges, and stayed by his side through success and through sickness. The year-by-year growth of Steve Jobs from childhood to legacy, 1955 to 2011. 1955, the birth of a mystery. February 24th, 1955. Born in San Francisco, California. Born to a Syrian father, Abdul Fattah Jandali, and German-American mother, Joanne Schiebel. Given up for adoption immediately. Adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, blue-collar, humble, working-class family in Mountain View. From the very beginning, Steve was unwanted, then chosen. That sense of abandonment and identity shaped his emotional world. 1961 to 1968. Childhood rebel. Enrolled in Monta Loma Elementary School. Wild and bored in class, often pulled pranks. Teachers found him hard to handle. 4th grade, met Teddy Hill, the teacher who changed his life. Began excelling after her encouragement. Skipped a grade. Growth insight. This is where his need to challenge authority and create his own path began. 1968 to 1972, high school years. Attended Homestead High School in Cupertino. Became close with Steve Wozniak, a tech wizard 4 years older. Joined the Hewlett-Packard Explorers Club, where he saw his first computer. Got a summer job at HP after cold calling Bill Hewlett. Experimented with LSD Eastern philosophy and began questioning materialism. Growth insight. These years built his early obsession with electronics, spirituality, and innovation. 1972. Brief college life. Enrolled at Reed College in Oregon. Dropped out after 1 semester, but continued attending classes that interested him. Took calligraphy, which later inspired the Macintosh's font design. Slept on friends' floors, returned Coke bottles for food money. Growth insight, refused to follow systems, chose intuition over convention. 1974 to 1975, spiritual awakening, worked briefly at Atari. Traveled to India searching for meaning and spiritual answers. Returned changed, minimalist, introspective, deeply focused. Growth insight, learned focus, simplicity, and purpose. This shaped his design principles and leadership. 1976, the birth of Apple. Co-founded Apple Computer Inc. with Steve Wozniak and Ronald Wayne. Created the Apple I in his garage, sold to hobbyists. Introduced the Apple II, the first mass-market home computer. Growth. Insight. Realized the power of packaging vision plus technology plus storytelling. 1977 to 1980. Rapid rise. Apple became a serious player in personal computing. Hired business-minded leaders to scale the company. At age 25, Jobs became a multimillionaire. In 1980, Apple went public. Jobs' shares were worth over $200 million. Growth insight. From a barefoot college dropout to a powerful tech founder. 1981 to 1984, the Macintosh Revolution. Vision. Build a friendly, beautifully designed computer anyone could use. Launched the Macintosh in 1984 with the iconic 1984 Super Bowl ad. The GUI, mouse, fonts, all new ideas that shocked the world. Growth insight, mastered presentation, aesthetic, and disruption. 1985. The fall. Internal battles at Apple with then CEO John Sculley. Board sided with Sculley. Steve Jobs was forced out of Apple, the company he created. Growth insight. His ego shattered, but the loss sparked a second awakening. 1986 to 1995. The comeback begins. Founded Next Inc., focusing on high-end computers for education. Bought Pixar from George Lucas for $10 million. Next failed commercially, but its software was brilliant. Pixar created Toy Story, 1995, the first computer-animated film, massive success. Growth insight, these failure years were seeds for the future. He rebuilt slowly, but smartly. 1996, the return to Apple. Apple was failing without him. Apple acquired Next for $429 million. And Steve returned as advisor. By 1997, he was interim CEO, then permanent CEO. Growth insight, came back wiser, more focused, more dangerous. 1998 to 2001, the design era begins. Introduced the iMac, colorful, sleek, and user-friendly. Apple branding became cool, clean, and aspirational. Introduced Mac OS X, based on Next software. Prepared the world for a revolution. Growth insight, found the balance between art and engineering. 2001, the iPod and digital music. Introduced the iPod. 1,000 songs in your pocket. Launched iTunes Store to purchase songs legally online. Began to disrupt the entire music industry. Growth insight, understood that hardware plus software plus content is unbeatable. 2007, the iPhone, a new world. Introduced the iPhone, combining phone, iPod, and internet. Changed communication, photography, navigation, and even human behavior. Apple's value skyrocketed. Growth insight, proved he wasn't just an inventor. He was a visionary futurist. 2008 to 2010. The final act. Introduced the App Store, changing how software is sold forever. Launched the iPad in 2010, a new category of computing. Began stepping back from public life due to illness. Growth insight. Built a legacy company. Apple could now survive without him. 2011, the final goodbye. Resigned as CEO of Apple in August 2011. Passed away October 5, 2011 at age 56 from pancreatic cancer. Left behind a wife, 4 children, and a company that became the most valuable in the world. Steve Jobs' work, travels, and global impact. How his journeys shaped his genius. 1. India, 1974. The Spiritual Awakening. At just 19, Steve Jobs traveled to India with his friend Dan Kotke. He wasn't looking for technology. He was searching for truth. He visited Himachal Pradesh, meeting ascetics and gurus. He shaved his head, wore Indian robes, and meditated under trees. He lived on limited food, walked barefoot in villages, and reflected on life. Impact on Jobs. Learned the value of simplicity. It became the core of Apple design. Embraced minimalism, which later shaped the clean UI of Apple devices. Discovered that intuition matters more than intellect. Adopted Zen-like clarity that influenced his speeches and leadership. Quote, "The people in the Indian countryside don't use their intellect like we do. They use intuition instead." 2. Silicon Valley, California, USA. The tech cradle. Steve grew up in Mountain View, which later became part of Silicon Valley. He worked summer jobs at Hewlett-Packard. He joined Atari in nearby Los Gatos. His garage in Los Altos became the birthplace of Apple. Impact on Jobs, surrounded by the tech elite and innovators. Learned early about engineering, circuits, and business pitches. Witnessed the birth of the microprocessor revolution. Understood how innovation could change entire industries. Lesson: Silicon Valley gave him the tools, but India gave him the vision. 3. Europe travels, design, and aesthetics. Inspiration. Jobs made multiple trips to Germany, Italy, and France, especially during his next years and early Apple days. He admired German craftsmanship, precision in machinery and product design. He was inspired by Italian minimalism, the harmony of form and function. He toured Bauhaus museums, absorbing their less is more philosophy. Impact on Jobs. These travels sharpened his obsession with elegance in technology, influenced Apple's sleek industrial designs, no unnecessary screws, no cluttered menus, deepened his belief that design is not just what it looks like, but how it works. Apple's glass stores, iMac shapes, iPhone finishes, all carried this European minimalism DNA. 4. Pixar and Hollywood, the storytelling evolution. Though he didn't travel globally for Pixar often, his work took him deep into Hollywood's storytelling machine. Collaborated with Disney and top animators, studied cinematic storytelling, emotional pacing, and character arcs. Impact on Jobs brought cinematic thinking to product launches. Every keynote became a movie-like journey, with setup, conflict, climax, and twist. Used storytelling to turn devices into emotional experiences, not just tools. Think about the iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Not tech specs, but emotion. 5 worldwide product launches and influence from the Macintosh in 1984 to the iPhone in 2007, Jobs' launches created global movements. He toured Japan to learn about manufacturing efficiency and hardware quality. He worked with Foxconn in China for Apple production. He visited Germany and the UK for media appearances and market expansion. Held global Apple events watched by millions, like Hollywood premieres. Impact on Jobs became the face of global innovation. Studied different market behaviors, adapting product experience for each culture. Realized the emotional power of universal design. 6. Global legacy. World impact of his work. Steve Jobs didn't just travel the world, he changed it. His iPhone made instant global communication possible. His iTunes store changed how the world consumes music. His MacBook influenced creative industries globally, from artists to architects. Apple stores became design landmarks in major cities. Tokyo, Paris, Dubai, New York. Impact on the world, education, Kids in remote villages now learn on iPads. Business. Millions of entrepreneurs started with a MacBook and iPhone. Art and film. Creators use Apple tools to design, animate, and produce. Every continent has felt Steve Jobs' fingerprint through the devices in our pockets and the ideas in our minds. Summary. How travel and culture gave him ideas. Steve Jobs' deepest confessions and life secrets, unspoken truths of a visionary mind. 1. I wasn't always a good person. In his final years, Steve Jobs admitted with regret that he had made many personal mistakes. He spoke about being cruel to coworkers, ignoring people who cared, and having an intense ego. He said, "I wish I had spent more time with my kids." In his biography, he told Walter Isaacson, "I was hard on people I worked with, and some of them felt it. I wanted them to be better, and sometimes I went too far." Secret insight. Behind the perfectionist leader was a man haunted by his lack of emotional control. He confessed that success sometimes came at the cost of empathy. 2. I denied my own daughter. Steve's biggest personal regret, denying that Lisa Brennan was his biological daughter for years. Lisa was born in 1978, but Jobs initially refused to acknowledge her. He even signed a legal document saying he was infertile and sterile. He later admitted the truth and formed a relationship with her, but the guilt never fully left him. Quote, I failed Lisa in many ways, but she was the best thing that ever happened to me. Secret insight. Jobs confessed that his arrogance and fear of imperfection made him reject responsibility. It was a deep emotional wound that stayed with him until the end. 3. Intuition is more powerful than intellect. Though seen as a tech mastermind, Jobs constantly confessed that he relied on intuition more than logic. He credited spirituality, Zen meditation, and Eastern philosophy for shaping his decisions. He confessed he would often walk alone in silence for hours to hear his next big idea. He believed that the universe guided him, not just data or science. Quote, the people who made the biggest difference are the ones who could connect spirituality with technology. Secret insight. His secret was not math, but meaning. He believed in a soul-guided creativity, a mix of energy, vision, and faith. 4. I delayed my cancer treatment, and that was my biggest mistake. In a rare moment of honesty, Jobs admitted something heartbreaking. After his cancer diagnosis in 2003, he chose to avoid surgery and follow natural healing methods like fruit diets and meditation. 9 months passed before he went for medical treatment. He later regretted that decision deeply. Quote, I didn't want my body to be opened. I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. Secret insight. The man who revolutionized the world's technology couldn't save himself from his own fear of science over spirit. 5. Technology is not enough. Even though he created the iPhone, iPad, Mac, iTunes, Jobs revealed that he feared technology becoming addictive and soulless. He never let his kids use iPads for long. He believed in limiting screen time and nurturing real creativity. He said, technology should serve the heart, not replace it. Quote, we think we're giving our kids tools, but we're handing them distractions. Secret insight. His greatest fear was that the very tools he built could be used to disconnect humanity, not unite it. 6. My success was fueled by pain. Jobs never hid that pain was his teacher. Being adopted left him with a permanent fear of not being wanted. Getting fired from Apple in 1985 shattered his ego, but gave him space to rebuild everything better. Quote, getting fired from Apple was the best thing that ever happened to me. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. Secret insight. Every fall gave him a new mountain to climb. His secret wasn't comfort, it was turning suffering into invention. 7. Death is the best invention of life. Perhaps his most chilling confession came during his 2005 Stanford speech. He knew he was dying and used that awareness to sharpen his focus. He said, "Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose." Quote, "Death is life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new." Secret insight. Jobs embraced death as a motivator. He lived with urgency because he knew time was borrowed. Bonus. Unpublished notes from his private diaries. Some rare quotes and secrets from Jobs' personal journals later surfaced. "I am learning to forgive, but I am not good at it yet. I dream of building machines that heal minds, not just entertain them. Sometimes I think I came from another world. This one moves too slow. One day we will realize that energy, emotion, and electricity are all the same thing." These confessions reveal a man who didn't just build products. He wrestled with eternity, emotion, and existence. Final reflection, what his confessions reveal. Steve Jobs was not just an inventor. He was a man who ran from love, then returned to it, who rejected science, then feared death, who built tools but warned of their misuse, who believed that the future belongs to the soul, not just the system. And in the end, his deepest secret was this: the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Steve Jobs' beliefs and philosophy, the inner world that created the outer revolution. 1. Eastern spirituality over Western materialism. Steve Jobs was deeply influenced by Zen Buddhism and Hindu teachings. In the 1970s, he traveled to India in search of spiritual truth, not business. He met ascetics, walked barefoot in villages, and meditated in temples. After returning, he embraced a Zen mindset: silence, minimalism, focus. Quote, "The people in the Indian countryside don't use their intellect like we do. They use their intuition instead. And intuition is more powerful." Core belief. Truth isn't found in books or logic. It's found in silence, nature, and the self. 2. Simplicity is supreme. One of Jobs' most famous philosophies, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. He believed the world was full of noise, and greatness comes from removing distraction. The iPod, iPhone, Mac, all were designed with minimalism and clarity. Even his personal life was simple: bare homes, barefoot meetings, basic clothes. Quote, "Design is not just what it looks like. Design is how it works." Core belief: clutter is the enemy of genius. Simplify to amplify. 3. Reality can be bent by vision. Jobs had what colleagues called a reality distortion field. He believed that the world wasn't fixed. It could be bent by imagination. If someone said something was impossible, he simply ignored them. He believed that belief itself was a weapon and used it to push limits. Quote, "The ones who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do." Core belief. The future is not something we wait for, it's something we build. 4. Death gives life. Meaning. After being diagnosed with cancer, Jobs' view of death became spiritual and inspiring. He saw death not as an enemy, but a teacher. In his legendary Stanford speech, he said, "Remembering that you're going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose." Core belief. Mortality is a compass. Knowing we'll die gives us clarity, urgency, and truth. 5. Technology plus art equals magic. Jobs didn't believe in cold engineering. He believed in the marriage of science and the soul. He loved calligraphy, music, and design just as much as code. He said true innovation comes when technology serves beauty and emotion. Quote, "Technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with liberal arts, with the humanities, that yields the results that make our hearts sing. Core belief. The world doesn't need more machines. It needs machines that feel human. 6. The universe is alive. Steve Jobs believed that everything, people, energy, ideas, was connected. He often said intuition is a form of universal intelligence. He once described the mind as a receiver, tuning into frequencies from the cosmos. Quote, "My favorite things in life don't cost any money. It's really clear that the most precious resource we all have is time." Core belief. There's more to life than logic. The unseen world is just as real. 7. God is in the details. While Jobs didn't believe in a traditional God, he felt the divine in design, energy, and harmony. He insisted that even the parts of a computer the customer never saw be beautiful. He believed craftsmanship was spiritual. Quote, "Be a yardstick of quality. Some people aren't used to an environment where excellence is expected." Core belief. Doing your best even when no one sees it. That's where God lives. 8. Follow your heart, not the system. Jobs dropped out of college, ignored market research, defied industry rules. He didn't trust systems built by others. He trusted his gut. He said, "Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice." Core belief. Freedom isn't rebellion. It's alignment with your own inner truth. Final summary. The philosophy of Jobs. Steve Jobs wasn't just an inventor of products. He was an architect of meaning. He believed simplicity creates clarity, spirituality feeds creativity, death inspires life, the universe is intelligent, and your heart is the compass. His entire life philosophy could be summarized in this: stay hungry, stay foolish. Because the people who stay curious and keep dreaming are the ones who change the world. The enemies and betrayals of Steve Jobs, a genius surrounded by resistance. 1. The board that betrayed him, Apple firing, 1985. This is the most painful betrayal of Jobs' life. Steve Jobs co-founded Apple in 1976 in his garage, but less than 10 years later, in 1985, he was forced out of the company he built with his own hands. He had hired John Sculley, Pepsi's CEO, as Apple's new CEO in 1983. Jobs asked him, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or come with me and change the world?" But within 2 years, their relationship collapsed. Why? Jobs was passionate, rebellious, and perfectionistic. He clashed with Sculley on product direction and company strategy. Eventually, Apple's board sided with Sculley, and Steve Jobs was removed from all operational control. Imagine being thrown out of your own dream. Jobs later said, "Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have happened to me. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life." But make no mistake, this was the betrayal that broke his heart. 2. Bill Gates and Microsoft, the copy war. Steve Jobs had a fierce and complicated relationship with Bill Gates. In the 1980s, Jobs accused Gates of copying Apple's graphical user interface to build Windows. He famously shouted, "You're stealing from us." Gates replied calmly, "Well, Steve, I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal the TV, but you broke in first and said it was yours." The war between Apple and Microsoft lasted for decades. Jobs saw Gates as uninspired, unoriginal, and too business-minded. He once said, "Bill is basically unimaginative and has never invented anything. He just shamelessly ripped off other people's ideas." But Gates, in turn, believed Jobs was too emotional, too impractical. They were rivals of vision and value. 3. The Xerox betrayal. The stolen interface. In the late 1970s, Jobs visited Xerox PARC, a research lab where advanced computing was being developed. There, he saw a graphical user interface, folders, icons, a mouse, decades ahead of its time. Apple used those ideas to develop the Macintosh. Many critics accused Jobs of stealing Xerox's innovations, but Jobs claimed Xerox could have owned the entire computer industry, but they had no idea what they had. Was it betrayal or brilliance? To some, Jobs was a thief. To others, he was the only one smart enough to act. 4. Employees who feared or hated him. Steve Jobs was known for being brilliant, yes, but also brutal. He would call people's ideas garbage in meetings. He demanded perfection, obedience, and emotional stamina. Employees said working under him felt like a military zone. Some people quit Apple because of the stress. Others broke down in tears. Many respected him deeply, but from a distance. One Apple engineer said Steve could be a tyrant. He was a genius, but also very hard to love. Jobs even manipulated people to push performance, using guilt, praise, or even silence. In the end, his vision led Apple to greatness, but it also left emotional scars on many who worked under him. 5. His daughter, and the denial that haunted him. One of the most personal betrayals? Jobs denied paternity of his first daughter, Lisa Brennan Jobs, for several years. He had her with his high school girlfriend, Chrisanne Brennan, in 1978. But he refused to admit Lisa was his daughter, even though a DNA test proved it. He even named a computer Lisa, but later denied it was named after her. Lisa wrote in her memoir, "For a long time, I believed I didn't matter to him, that I was unwanted, that I was nothing." Eventually, Jobs accepted her, and they built a relationship. But the emotional damage was deep. This was perhaps his greatest personal mistake, a betrayal not of others, but of himself. 6. Betrayal by investors. The next struggles after being fired from Apple, Jobs founded Next, a new computer company. He invested millions, built a new operating system, designed futuristic machines, but Next failed in the market. Too expensive, too niche, too ahead of its time. Jobs lost much of his early money and felt abandoned by investors who once cheered him. Still, he didn't quit. Ironically, Apple later bought Next and brought Jobs back in 1997. He turned the failure into a comeback. 7. The media and public, from hero to monster. In the early 2000s, as Jobs transformed Apple into a tech giant again, the media began turning on him. They called him controlling, accused Apple of anti-competitive behavior, exposed his harsh employee treatment, criticized his secrecy and paranoia. Many called him a tech dictator. Even while building iPods, iPhones, iPads, Jobs was often painted as the villain of Silicon Valley. But here's the twist. He didn't care. He said, "If you want to make everyone happy, don't be a leader. Sell ice cream." Conclusion. The betrayals shaped the legend. Steve Jobs was betrayed by the board of Apple, his closest hires, his competitors, his partners, his own past. But he also betrayed friends, family, his own emotions. That's what makes his story human. Not just genius, but brokenness. Not just invention, but redemption. In the end, Jobs transformed every betrayal into a lesson. Every enemy is a mirror. Every failure goes in a new direction. That's not a weakness. That's the definition of a visionary. Final words. The man who saw the future. Steve Jobs was not just a man who built Apple. He was a storm, a visionary who collided with the world and forged